It's the early 1980s, and an enthusiastic caller dials into a local television station to tell them something incredible. They just had their carpets cleaned, and the worker had done a good job, sure, but most impressively, the founder of the company in question, Barry Minkow, was only 16 years old. Soon after, a reporter from the station called Barry Minkow to interview him for a story that airs throughout the area. The publicity boosts sales at the company, launching it on a trajectory so dramatic that a few years later, the company, Z-Best, lists itself on the NASDAQ, and Barry Minkow, still only 20, is the youngest person to ever take a company public. It's a record that still stands. But there's a catch, one that defines everything that follows. The person who called in the television station, that was no customer. That was Barry Minkow. Barry Minkow didn't just lie in order to win some free marketing. He lied about basically everything that had to do with Z-Best. But people kept believing him for a long time. Long enough for him to end up being interviewed on Oprah and have a net worth, on paper at least, of over $100 million. The most important of these lies had to do with how Z-Best made its money. The carpet cleaning business, which by most accounts was legitimate and performed quality work, wasn't very profitable. So Minkow created a second branch of the business, insurance restoration. Z-Best would book millions in revenue for remodeling. For example, the interior of a high-rise building whose sprinkler system had been set off during a fire. These contracts didn't exist whatsoever, which meant that Minkow could book them as profitably as he wanted. This helped the stock price of Z-Best rise from $4 per share at its original offering to $16, quadrupling in a relatively short time and leading one analyst to tell Businessweek, Barry Minkow is a great manager. The beauty of the restoration business for Minkow was not just that he could suddenly choose his own revenue, but that it was easier to fake than the alternative, which would have been making up thousands of carpet cleaning jobs. A single restoration job could be sold to auditors as representing many millions. And the auditors did look. Maybe not all that hard, but Minkow did have to try a little bit at his deception. For example, accountants from Ernst & Winnie asked to see a $7 million restoration job in Sacramento. Of course, there was no job, but this was just a minor problem. Minkow called a local real estate business and told them he might be looking to lease one of their vacant buildings. They gave him the keys in order to check it out, and the accountants were impressed to see the quality of restoration that Z-Best had done in the building as they walked through. It was as though there had never been any damage in the first place. Another time, Z-Best got lazy with their claims, and they told people they had a large contract restoring an 8-story building in a town whose tallest building turned out to only be 3 stories high. No problem, though. Minkow had his associate lie on his back on a sidewalk and take pictures of that building from a perspective that made it appear like it was as tall as it needed to be. Despite their best efforts, the Z-Best fraud eventually unraveled, not from any big lie, but really from general pettiness. Minkow and company had developed a tactic for helping pay for things by overcharging customer credit cards and hoping they didn't notice. One woman noticed, and then, once caught, for some reason, Minkow didn't credit her back her funds. She eventually went to the press, who found many others with similar complaints. Pressure built, investigations were launched, and the whole thing fell apart. The analyst who'd previously called Minkow a great manager said, "A lot of us wish we hadn't said a lot of things." Investors lost money, Z-Best folded, and Barry Minkow went to prison. And yet, somehow, we're only at the middle of this story. Minkow served 7.5 years of his 25-year sentence and emerged an evangelical Christian. Because of course. He became a pastor, but in 1997, his past came calling. A church member asked him to look into a money management firm, which led him to helping authorities uncover what turned out to be a $300 million pyramid scheme. This led him to found the Fraud Discovery Institute. He was still working as a pastor, but had begun conducting research into companies suspected of wrongdoing on the side. 60 Minutes profiled him in 2006 because the only thing America loves more than a child prodigy is a child prodigy with a redemption narrative, and business picked up. He began going after public companies, and his reports had the ability to move markets. But of course, this was Barry Minkow. He was accused and admitted to being what today would be called kind of a smash and grab short seller. He wasn't rooting out frauds for the good of the people. He was betting a company's shares would fall in value and then causing them to fall himself, then taking the profit without worrying about whether his charges would stick. It's technically legal, but maybe not a great practice for a pastor. And then, in one case, he went too far. He alerted on Lennar, a construction and real estate business. The problem for Barry was that, in this case, he had material, non-public information. Through the Fraud Discovery Institute, he'd built up a relationship with federal investigators, and he knew for a fact that, based on his tip, they'd opened up an investigation into Lennar. He then went ahead and bought a bunch of put options, knowing that the announcement of the investigation would tank the stock. These actions led Barry to pleading guilty on an insider trading charge and being sentenced to an additional 5 years in prison. Also, Lennar was able to disprove the claims that had been made against them. Barry was still in prison when the next sentence came down from the judge's bench. It turned out that he'd been defrauding members of his church. Over the course of several years, he'd diverted as much as $3 million in donations to, among other things, helping fund a movie about his life in which he was supposed to star. This whole saga reminds me of the parable of the scorpion and the frog. A scorpion wants to cross a river but cannot swim, so it asks a frog to carry it across. The frog hesitates, afraid that the scorpion might sting it, but the scorpion promises not to. If it did, they would both drown. The scorpion then goes on to sting the frog as they're crossing. "But why?" asks the frog with its dying breath. "It's in my nature," replies the scorpion. The movie Barry Minkow tried to fund with stolen money got made. It came out in 2018. Originally titled Minkow and written as a story of redemption, it was rewritten and retitled. The analyst caught praising Minkow as a talented manager explained his dilemma, stating, "Barry had a big show, and he was magical. He was mesmerizing. He won everybody over." The movie was titled Con Man. Barry Minkow was released again in 2019. There's a new docuseries about his life in the works. Thanks for watching, guys.